Hello everyone, welcome back. It's part 3 of our screencast looking at the political realities of globalization and contextualization. We're actually in part 2 of our discussion, part 3 of our screencast. It's hard to keep all the numbers in place, but at least you know that we're here, and we're going to start talking now about the issue of global governance, something that we've introduced in previous classes, but we want to look at it a little more carefully now, especially since our readings are turning in that direction. And to start us off, let's look at this particular quote from Slaughter's section in Lechner and Bolai's Globalization Reader. She says, in a world in which their ability to use their hard power is often limited, governments must be able to exploit the uses of soft power, the power of persuasion and information. And so here we have our idea about the knowledge society or the knowledge economy coming back to help us think about global governance. So we're not talking about hard power. We're not talking about coercion in the sort of military or the more direct economic or political sense. We're talking about soft power now in terms of persuasion and information, which can be quite coercive, but not in the same way that you would have with these examples pointed out here. So we're shifting. Global governance has to do more with soft power and persuasion and information than hard power. She goes on to say that this is the globalization paradox. We need more government on a global and a regional scale, but we don't want the centralization of decision-making power and coercive authority so far from the people actually to be governed. Now the point here is that yes, indeed, we do have a paradox, but what I think she's setting up is that there's this need for government that is both regional and global as well as state. But the problem is that when you centralize decision-making authority at that global or regional level and move it away from the people actually being governed at the state or the local level, then we have our paradox, then we have our dilemma. Right? Because when there is coercive authority and decision-making power that's removed from the people, then it becomes this paradox. We have the people here. We have the global or the regional government governance entities here. We have the state government here, and you can see that there is then, if we look at it in this sort of hierarchical way, there's this gap between the decision-making power and the authority and what's actually happening on the ground. That's the paradox. How do we then smush this so that these levels come together or that this gap is eliminated? Well, she goes on to point out that one way that this is being addressed is through the implementation of government networks. And she says that government networks are booming and that they take place in two ways predominantly. Horizontal government networks, which you can see are in yellow, so that would be here. And vertical government networks, which is in purpley, lilac-y color, which is here. Right? The horizontal networks are links between counterpart national officials across borders. So the folks in the US and the folks in Canada, or in the UK and France, or in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and I'm just going to go way far and say Finland, right? That these horizontal networks between government officials where they make arrangements to share information, to share policies, to exchange ideas about, in our case, education and the way that education can develop, those would be an example of horizontal government networks because it's from one nation or one set of national officials to the other. But we also have, and I think this is what she finds interesting, at least what I find interesting about what she's saying, is this idea of vertical government networks, which are links between national government officials and their supranational counterparts. Now, these supranational counterparts can be part of IGOs, intergovernmental organizations like World Bank, like OECD, like a whole bunch of others, or international non-governmental organizations, right? And those would, another IGO would be the UN. So international non-government organizations would be more like civil society organizations, or things like Save the Children. There we go. Or Amnesty International. Sorry, my handwriting's horrible, but you get the point where we're going there, right? So these supranational officials at these IGOs and INGOs will then be interacting in a vertical level with the national officials, and that governance then will take place within this sort of triad, or within this horizontal and vertical network space. Now what she says then is that we need to consider our implicit mental maps of the international system, or even world order. And she argues that it's a flat map, pre-Columbian, like this example here, right? With states at the level of the land and the international system floating above them somewhere. International organizations also inhabit this floating realm. They are apart from and somehow above the states that are their members. So just like this map is a flat map example of pre-Columbian, right? Flat map example of how we can geographically locate different places, but there's no real understanding of distance between. I think this is supposed to be Greenland, and this is the UK here in current terms, right? There's no real sense of the distance. There's no real sense of the terrain. It's very sort of point of view-ish and simplistic. So it's flat. Right? It doesn't have all the complexity in it. And what she's arguing is that this is in many ways, let me get this ink off of here, is that this is in many ways like this vertical and horizontal government network map. Our implicit mental maps of these networks are flat. And that is somehow a mistake. Right? Because we know that there is much more complexity. We know there is much more nuance to the way that the supranational level and the national level are interacting with each other and within each other. Because we could also put another supranational box here and say that there are horizontal networks that are happening between supranational officials, and so then we'd have, holy smoke. We've got a whole bunch of arrows we can, you can keep adding on both sides. And it's a very complex network because some of these nations will overlap, others will overlap differently. Some, the range and the variety of networks that we can then develop out of this flat map it becomes much more complicated. So where she goes with this is she says that in a world of government networks, by contrast, the same officials who are judging, regulating, and legislating domestically are also reaching out to their foreign counterparts to help address the governance problems that arise when national actors and issues spill beyond their borders. In other words, in this flat map version, there seems to be always the outside-in approach, which is what this is signifying in this circle with these arrows, right? The idea is that there is always the implicit understanding of the implicit mental map of external forces that are breaking into the nation state, or of supranational forces that are somehow coercing or operating the national level without the reciprocal arrangement from the national level. And what she's saying is, let me erase the ink again. What she's saying is that instead of that always, global environment poking in map, we have to consider that the nation state is also exerting its own influence on the global environment, on the supranational level, on the IGOs and the INGOs, and that is a dynamic relationship that is not represented by our flat map implicit understandings of how global governance works. Now we can complicate this a little bit more if we look at Dodgson, Lee, and Dagger's section on global health governance in Lechner and Boley. And what I've done is I've taken this quote from page 279 in the text, and wherever they talked about health, I replaced with the word education. Now, one of the reasons why I did this before we actually get into what they say is that health and education are both worldwide institutions that have very similar characteristics in some important ways. For example, both health and education purport to serve the total population. Right? In other words, they are large and necessary institutions for the operation of most societies. You have to have a healthcare system, or you have to have health issues addressed. You have to have education or education issues addressed. These are both considered human rights issues, and they also are both very permeable from the outside. In other words, they're not closed systems. So the health system and the education system in most countries worldwide have people who are not experts in the field who are a dominant part of the actual system itself. In the case of education, we have students, we have parents, we have community leaders or business and industry leaders that are always coming in and penetrating the education system and either questioning or working alongside the education professionals that are employed within the system. And in the healthcare system, you have a very similar arrangement, although the professionalization of the healthcare providers that are employed within the system is much different than the education providers in the education system. That's another discussion about professionalization. But the idea is that those people who are patients, who are family members, who are in other parts of the community, who penetrate the system and will often either question or go for second opinions or manage their own participation in the healthcare system, are also part of that public permeation. So there's a larger literature looking at how health and education are similar institutions. It's one of the reasons why I think this is a very relevant chapter for us to consider in this course focusing on comparative and international education. All right, so to the quote. On page 279, Dodgson, Lee, and Dagger say, globalization is characterized by a growth in the number and degree of influence of non-state actors in education governance. Right? So globalization then is akin to the growth in the number and degree of influence of non-state actors. Those would be those, in many ways, those NGOs or INGOs and those IGOs. They go on to say that new combinations of both state and non-state actors are rapidly forming in a myriad of forms such as partnerships, alliances, coalitions, networks, and joint ventures. So when I got my messy thing here, right, where we have all these different networks and we're going to, overlap them in all sorts of different ways, that's where these guys are headed. They say that the apparent hybridization of governance mechanisms around certain, around certain education issues is a reflection of the search for more effective ways of cooperation to promote education in the face of new institutions. So the hybridization of governance mechanisms. And which issues then is this hybridization occurring around? So we have this idea that globalization is the expansion and enhancement of the role of non-state actors. We have this idea that the combinations of state and non-state actor relationships are quite complex. And we have, again, the idea that this hybridization of governance mechanisms takes place around particular issues. And so the idea is which issues require this kind of non-state, state actor, national, supranational network combination in order to effectively address those issues. That's where we're headed next. Okay. I'm going to pause here. Actually, I see the time's running out on our 15 minutes, so I'm going to pause here. We're going to come back and we're going to look at some more from Dodgson, Lee, and Dagger.